Okay, we're going to be working on page 101. We're going to be solving quadratic equations, and we're going to use three different methods. This first group is going to be by factoring. You'll recall from last term that to factor, the first thing we always check for is there a common factor? And in these two terms, you can see that there's an x that's common to both. So you factor that out, and how you decide what goes in the parentheses is what do I multiply by x to get x squared? What do I multiply by x to get negative 9x? Then when you have it separated into factors, we use the zero product property, which says if two things multiplied together equals 0, one of them has to be 0. So we put x equals 0, and then we put x minus 9 equals 0. This one's already solved. This one we add 9 to both sides. And so my two answers are x equals 0 and x equals 9. If I'm recalling correctly, the way they ask you to put it in the My Math Lab is a solution set. So you would just enter 0 and 9. You wouldn't put the x equals part. All right, next we're moving over to number 13. We're going to talk in a few minutes about another way to solve this one, but the instructions for this particular one said to solve by factoring. So I recognize that this is the difference of squares, which can be factored as the sum and difference of the two square roots. Then once you have it factored, you set each factor equal to 0. And then you solve each part. So this one we would subtract 5 from both sides. And this one we would add 5 to both sides. And so my solution set for this one would be negative 5 and positive 5. All right, I'm moving on down to number 15. And you recognize this one's what we call quadratic form. It has a squared to the first power and a number. And so we're going to solve it by factoring. And we notice that this is a 1. When that leading coefficient is a 1, then all we have to do is find two numbers that we can multiply to get negative 6 and combine to get positive 1, this invisible 1 that's right there. So the two numbers that I can multiply to get negative 6 and combine to get 1, a positive 1, would be a positive 3 and a negative 2. Because if I multiply those, I get negative 6, and if I add them together, I get positive 1. So since this is z squared, we just put z and z, and then the equals 0. So now I have it separated, so I take each factor, put it equal to 0, and solve. So in this one, I add negative 3 to both sides, and in this one, I add 2 to both sides. So my answers are negative 3 and positive 2. Now, number 17 also has that squared first power number form, but this time the leading coefficient is not a 1. For those of you that are new to the course this term, you may have learned a different way to factor this. And if you did and it works for you, I'm completely okay with that. For those of you that were with me last term, recall that we primarily did it by grouping. So we made us an x, and we multiplied this 2 times this negative 3 and put that at the top of the x. And then whatever this term was, I put it at the bottom of the x. And then I had to find two numbers that if I multiply them, I get this, and if I add them, I get this. So that would be a -6 and a +1, because the product of those is -6 and the sum is -5. Now, what you do is you're going to use these two terms to replace this. So we're going to copy the 2x squared, and instead of -5x, we're going to replace it with these two, which is a -6x plus a 1x, and then I'm going to copy the -3. Now I have 4 terms, and the way you factor 4 terms is to factor by grouping. So I group the first 2 and look to see what can I factor out of those, and I see that I can factor a 2 and an x. And again, what goes in the parentheses, you ask, what do I multiply by 2x to get 2x squared? What do I multiply by 2x to get -6x? Now, once you have this binomial factor, you come down here and copy it. And then to decide what goes in this space, you ask, what do I multiply this by to get these two? And it would be a +1. You're going to need a sign, either a plus or minus, and a number to go here. So it's a +1 in this case. Now I can see that an x minus 3 is common, and my other factor is 2x plus 1. So now I have it factored. I set each factor equal to 0. In this one, I add 3. In this one, I need to subtract 1 and then divide by 2. So my answers for this one are 3 and -1/2. So that's examples of solving by factoring. All right, we're continuing with solving by factoring. Again, you always look for a common factor first, and -5 will divide into both of those, so I'm going to factor that out. And then I need to continue factoring. This is the difference of squares. So w plus 6 and w minus 6. Now, when you factor out a common factor, if there's not a variable with it, then that can't possibly be the factor that's 0. -5 is never equal to 0. So you don't have to worry about that one. You take the w plus 6, put it equal to 0, and w minus 6, and put it equal to 0. So in this one, we subtract 6. This one, we add 6. Whoops. So my answers are -6 and +6. All right, in number 21, it kind of looks like it's factored, but this -10 is not included. And if we add 10, that doesn't work because our zero product property requires that this side be 0. So what we're going to need to do is to distribute this, get x squared plus 3x minus 10, and then refactor it using all 3 terms. So since this is a 1, I'm just looking for 2 numbers that I can multiply to get -10 and combine to get a +3. So that would be a +5 and a -2. So I'm going to put x and x. And then again, I take each factor and set it equal to 0, subtract 5 from both sides, add 2 to both sides, and my answers are -5 and +2. Now, moving on down to number 23, I've got all my terms, but this side's not 0. So I need to subtract 12x. And to get it into the right form, when I subtract that 12x, I'm going to put it in the middle so that I have 4x squared minus 12x plus 9. Okay, I check to see if there's a common factor, and there's not. And my leading coefficient is not 1. So I'm going to need to multiply 4 times 9 and get a positive 36. I'm going to copy this negative 12. And I'm looking for two numbers that I multiply to get this and add to get this. That would be negative 6 and negative 6. So I copy the 4x squared. Instead of the 12x, I'm going to substitute these two. Negative 6x minus 6x plus 9. Now I do it by grouping. So from these two, what can I factor out is a 2x. And I get 2x minus 3. I copy 2x minus 3 down here and say, what do I multiply these two by to get this? And it would be a negative 3. So now what's common is 2x minus 3. The 2x minus 3 was common, and my other factor is made up of the 2x minus 3. Well, when you have the same exact factor, you only have to solve one of them. So I'm going to write 2x minus 3 equals 0. I'll add 3 and get, 2x equals 3, and I ran out of paper, so I'm going to come over here on the side. 2x equals 3. Now I divide by 2, and x equals 3/2. So that's my single answer. Whenever the factors back over here are the same, then you just come up with a single answer. Now we're going to look at solving quadratic equations by the square root method, by taking the square root of both sides. And you use this in two particular kinds of problems. When there's an x squared and no x, or when everything's already been factored into a quantity squared. So what we're going to do is take the square root of both sides. And the square root of x squared is x. And you always get both a positive and a negative when you take a square root. So the square root of 25 is both positive and negative 5. Now, sometimes my math lab lets you use a plus minus. Sometimes they want you to separate it into two answers. So you'll just have to work with that and see which one they'll accept. So this was basically the same problem that we had back on number 13. Just we could have subtracted the 25 and it would have been the same. So sometimes problems can be solved by factoring or by taking the square root, and then it becomes your choice. All right, on this one, when I take the square root of both sides, when you take the square root of something squared, you just get x minus 1. And the square root of 4 is plus or minus 2. But you don't have x by itself. So you've got x minus 1 equals positive 2, and x minus 1 equals negative 2. So you add 1, and you get x equals 3, add 1, and x equals negative 1. So this one has the two answers of 3 and negative 1. All right, on this one, when you take the square root of something that's been squared, you just get that quantity. So 1/3 h plus 4 equals plus or minus, and the square root of 16 is 4. So this generates two equations. 1/3 h plus 4 equals positive 4, and 1/3 h plus 4 equals negative 4. So we need to solve those two equations. So I'm going to subtract 4 and get 1/3 h equals 0. Divide by 1/3, and h equals 0, because 0 divided by 1/3 is still 0. On this side, I'm going to subtract 4, and I get 1/3 h equals negative 8. Then I need to divide by 1/3. So I can enter in my calculator negative 8 divided by 1/3, and I'll get negative 24. So this one has the two answers of 0 and negative 24.